Welcome to the EPIC podcast, the podcast about economic power and international conflict, EPIC. Today we are talking about a massive, frankly terrifying geopolitical earthquake, the escalating 2026 crisis with Iran. And we're doing this with our guest, the author of this really brilliant, highly provocative analytical report titled The Hidden Logic of the Iran Crisis, Petrodollar versus Geopolitics.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
So imagine waking up tomorrow, you turn on the news, and you find out that 20% of the entire world's energy supply has just vanished. I mean, the oil is still there sitting in these massive tanks in the Middle East, but the ships carrying it are completely trapped.
Paralyzed.
Yeah, paralyzed behind a wall of sea mines and naval artillery in this narrow little waterway called the Strait of Hormuz. Stock markets are in free fall. Supply chains are freezing. Allied nations in Europe and Asia are in a state of absolute existential panic. But, and this is the core of our deep dive today, if you look closely, if you strip away the chaos and look deep into the corridors of global finance, this disaster might not actually be a failure of diplomacy at all.
No, it might be the exact opposite.
Right. According to your report, it might be the exact choreographed blueprint required to save the American economy.
It is a staggering premise, honestly. It really forces us to completely reevaluate the difference between, what a superpower says it's doing publicly and the brutal mechanical reality of what it is actually engineering behind the scenes.
And before we get too deep into this, I need to give our listeners a quick disclaimer. Every time we do a deep dive here, our goal is to take dense geopolitical events and extract the underlying mechanics. The theories presented in your report and the think tank analyses from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, that we're cross-referencing today, they involve some intense political maneuvering.
Very intense.
Yeah. And we are not here to take any political sides, right or left. We're not endorsing the viewpoints of the original source material as absolute gospel either. Our job today is strictly to act as your guides. We're going to impartially map out this theory, translate the dense policy language, and show you exactly how these analysts construct their argument. We're just testing the structural integrity of the text.
Exactly. We're looking at the math, we're looking at the timeline, and we're just asking, does the behavior of the global market align with the stated political goals? Or does it point to something much deeper?
Which brings us to the central paradox of this deep dive. If you're listening to this right now, I want you to hold this question in your head. When you look at the massive military and economic deployments into the Middle East recently, is this genuinely about stopping Iran from building a nuclear weapon, or is this a massive high-stakes gamble to ensure the survival of the U.S. dollar?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question. And to be clear from the start, the analysis we're unpacking proposes that the current administration is actively utilizing a global crisis as an instrument of macroeconomic policy.
So let's start with the foundation of your report. You argue that leading up to 2026, the petrodollar was facing this unprecedented existential threat from global de-dollarization. Now, for the listener who isn't tracking obscure central bank swaps, and I mean, why would you? It's easy to miss why the U.S. dollar is supposedly bleeding out. Walk us through the mechanics. Why is the petrodollar suddenly so vulnerable?
Well, to understand the vulnerability, you first have to understand how the global circulatory system has operated for the last 50 years. Since the 1970s, the global trade in oil has overwhelmingly been priced and settled in United States dollars.
Which is a huge deal.
It's everything. It isn't just a tradition, it's a structural imperative. If a refinery in, say, South Korea or an industrial hub in India wants to buy a tanker of crude oil from Saudi Arabia, they don't pay in Korean won or Indian rupees. They have to go into the foreign exchange markets, acquire U.S. dollars, and then use those dollars to buy the oil.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this right here is the magic trick of the American economy. By forcing the entire world to buy oil in dollars, the U.S. basically guarantees that there is a permanent, insatiable, artificial global demand for its currency. Every nation on Earth has to keep stockpiles of dollars reserves just to keep their lights on.
That is exactly the magic trick. Because the world is forced to absorb our currency, the United States has the unique privilege of running massive trade deficits and accumulating staggering national debt without experiencing the catastrophic inflation that would, completely destroy any other country's currency.
We export our inflation.
Yeah, exactly. We export it. The petrodollar is the bedrock of American superpower status. But over the last decade, and accelerating wildly leading into 2025 and 2026, a coalition of nations decided they had had enough of subsidizing the American economy.
De-dollarization.
Precisely. We started seeing countries actively bypassing the dollar system. They were setting up these complex bilateral agreements to trade energy in their own local currencies. China buying Middle Eastern oil in yuan, India exploring rupee settlements, Russia demanding rubles.
And the goal there is just to insulate themselves from U.S. financial leverage.
Yeah.
Right, to insulate from leverage and American sanctions. And the report argues that this trend wasn't just a minor irritant anymore. It was reaching a critical mass. The global architecture was fundamentally tilting away from the dollar.
But here is where your text takes this highly abstract macroeconomic concept, currency exchange rates and all that, and violently anchors it to a physical geographical reality. You argue that the only way to stop de-dollarization isn't with better monetary policy, it's with control over the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes, because financial agreements, no matter how sophisticated they look on paper, are ultimately tethered to the physical delivery of goods.
The oil has to actually move.
It has to move.
Yeah.
And the Strait of Hormuz is the absolute physical choke point of the global energy market. It's this incredibly narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. Through that narrow band of water, approximately 1/5, 20% of the entire world's traded oil passes every single day.
I really want to emphasize the scale of that for a moment for you listening. 20% of global oil. We aren't talking about some minor shipping lane. If you visualize the global economy as a living organism, the Strait of Hormuz is the jugular vein, and it's incredibly vulnerable.
Highly vulnerable. It's narrow, the shipping lanes are shallow, and it is entirely flanked by nations that are heavily militarized.
And this physical vulnerability is the weapon that destroys de-dollarization.
Exactly. The logic is elegantly simple, but utterly devastating. Let's say China and Iran spend 5 years meticulously crafting a non-dollar financial architecture. They build shadow banking networks, they set up bilateral currency swaps in yuan, they completely cut the U.S. Treasury out of the loop. It is a masterpiece of financial evasion.
A totally insulated, dollar-free ecosystem.
Right. But what happens if the Strait of Hormuz is blocked by military conflict? What happens if sea mines are deployed or anti-ship ballistic missiles make the waterway uninsurable? Suddenly, those brilliant bilateral currency agreements are functionally obsolete.
Because it's like having a fully loaded, unlimited transit card in your pocket, but the actual physical train tracks have been blown up. The currency you agreed to use is totally irrelevant if the physical commodity cannot be put on a ship and moved across the ocean.
That is the exact mechanism. You can have all that you want in the world, but if the tanker can't leave the Gulf, your factories go dark. And the current escalation in 2026 has provided a terrifying, real-world demonstration of how fragile this link is. In the report, we quote Qatar's energy minister, Saad Al-Kaabi, who delivered a very stark warning to the global markets.
Walk us through what happened in Qatar, because that incident really shifted the tone from a theoretical risk to immediate, tangible panic.
Yeah, so following a series of Iranian proxy attacks near critical maritime infrastructure, Qatar was forced to temporarily suspend production at the Ras Laffan complex. Now, Ras Laffan isn't just a refinery. It is the beating heart of global liquefied natural gas, or LNG. And when production halted, Minister Al-Kaabi was incredibly blunt. He warned that if the conflict continued to escalate, all Gulf energy producers would be forced to halt exports. Not just reduce them, halt them entirely.
And what was his timeline on that? Because the market response to these kinds of shocks is usually measured in days, if not hours.
He said an export halt could happen within weeks. But the truly chilling part of his statement was regarding the recovery phase. He emphasized that even in the best-case scenario, even if an immediate ceasefire was declared and the shooting stopped tomorrow, it would take weeks to months merely to restore normal supply cycles.
Weeks to months just to get the oil flowing normally again, assuming absolutely nothing else goes wrong. I want to push back on this a bit, though. Let's say the strait closes. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, they're all effectively locked out of the global market for 2 months. Obviously, that causes a massive price spike. But how does a temporary physical blockade permanently rewrite the rules of global finance? How does an oil shortage save the U.S. dollar?
Because of the inelasticity of energy demand. If the strait closes, the world does not stop needing oil. The demand remains immediate, desperate, and inflexible. If you are the energy minister of Japan or Germany, you cannot tell your population to simply stop using electricity for 2 months while the Middle East sorts itself out.
You can't just pause the economy.
No, you have to look at the map, identify the producers who are safely outside the Persian Gulf, and buy absolutely everything they have.
Which triggers an immediate, panic-driven supply realignment. The world abandons the choke point and scrambles for the safe zones.
Exactly. And when you eliminate the entire Persian Gulf from the equation, the list of countries capable of actually delivering oil and gas reliably and at scale shrinks dramatically. In the report, we isolate this remaining lifeline list. It comes down to Brazil, Nigeria, Russia, Venezuela, the United States, Azerbaijan, Norway, Algeria, and Australia.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting. When you look at that specific list of safe haven producers, Brazil, Nigeria, Russia, Venezuela, the US, Azerbaijan, Norway, Algeria, Australia, what is the common denominator?
What's fascinating here is that the common denominator, the invisible thread binding almost all of these emergency suppliers together, is their structural reliance on the US dollar. The vast majority of these nations either traditionally transact their energy exports in dollars, or they are legally and financially constrained to the dollar ecosystem.
Let's break down those constraints mechanically, because it isn't just a matter of these countries politely choosing to use the dollar. They are trapped in it. Take Venezuela, for example.
Venezuela is bound by comprehensive U.S. sanctions. Their financial infrastructure has been deeply marginalized. If a desperate European nation suddenly needs Venezuelan heavy crude because the Middle East is on fire, Venezuela does not have the institutional capacity or the financial freedom to seamlessly invent a new non-dollar trading paradigm on the fly.
Right. Any major lifting of sanctions or emergency authorization to buy Venezuelan oil would be brokered through Washington in dollars. What about Russia? Because the conventional wisdom over the last few years is that Russia has completely divorced itself from the Western financial system. They've built the shadow fleet. They trade with China and India in local currencies. Wouldn't Russia be the perfect non-dollar alternative?
On paper, yes. In reality, the architecture is much messier.
Yeah.
Despite massive efforts to de-dollarize, Russia's energy trade still frequently intersects with dollar-denominated infrastructure. The shipping insurers, the secondary brokers, the complex maritime legal entities, many of them still have exposure to the dollar.
They can't entirely escape it.
No. And more importantly, look at the other major players on that safe haven list. The United States is obviously going to mandate that its own massive energy exports are paid for in dollars. Norway, Australia,
Okay.
Brazil, these are deeply entrenched in the traditional dollar-based global commodity markets.
So let's play this out for you listening. Let's extrapolate this to its logical conclusion. You are that panicked policymaker in an energy importing nation. The Strait of Hormuz is completely locked down. Your domestic energy reserves are draining by the hour. The Qataris are telling you it will be months before normal shipments resume. Your industrial base is threatening to shut down, which means mass unemployment and political collapse. So you approach Norway or the US or Brazil for an emergency supply.
And you are not negotiating from a position of strength. You don't have the luxury of spending 6 months haggling over currency swap lines or demanding to pay in your local fiat. You need the fuel on the water tomorrow.
And so you capitulate.
You capitulate. You sign massive, long-term, multi-year forward contracts to guarantee your energy security. And because you are dealing with this specific subset of producers, you sign those contracts in United States dollars.
Even if you are a nation that just spent the last decade aggressively trying to de-dollarize your economy, you sign in dollars out of absolute raw necessity.
This is the exact mechanism that the report identifies as reverse de-dollarization. The global de-dollarization trend wasn't stopped by better U.S. economic policy. It was forcefully reversed by a physical crisis in the Middle East that engineered a global panic buy from dollar-denominated suppliers.
That is, wow. It is breathtakingly Machiavellian. If this theory holds up, it means the ultimate defense of the American financial empire isn't taking place at the Federal Reserve. It is taking place at a maritime choke point halfway across the world.
And crucially, the pain of this mechanism is not distributed equally. It is highly asymmetric. A crisis like this targets specific geopolitical rivals with surgical precision while leaving the United States relatively insulated.
Let's talk about that asymmetry. Your report maps out how this Hormuz shutdown impacts the major power centers differently. Let's start with China. China has spent billions trying to secure its energy supply lines. How does this crisis leave them exposed?
China's position is actually incredibly precarious. Prior to the escalation in 2026, China was the primary purchaser of Iranian crude oil. But they weren't buying it on the open market. They were importing it through an incredibly complex, labyrinthine network of indirect channels.
We're dark fleets.
Right. We're talking about ships spoofing their transponder data,
Yeah.
ship-to-ship transfers in the middle of the ocean. Total evasion.
And the entire purpose of this cloak and dagger operation was to bypass dollar settlement.
Exactly. China was paying for this oil largely in yuan. They were successfully building a completely parallel, non-dollar energy architecture. It was the ultimate proof of concept for de-dollarization.
But then the geography trap snapped shut.
Right, a blockade at the Strait of Hormuz perfectly severs those specific non-dollar supply lines. It doesn't matter how sophisticated China's dark fleet is. If the ships physically cannot leave the Persian Gulf without being sunk, the oil doesn't move.
Whoa.
It is a surgical strike on Beijing's currency diversification strategy.
So China's entire shadow economy for energy collapses overnight. And what is their alternative?
They are forced to scramble into the open market to secure alternative sources. And as we just established, the nations capable of scaling up production outside the Gulf are deeply tied to the dollar system. Years of careful geopolitical maneuvering by Beijing are completely wiped out by a physical blockade. They are forced to crawl back to the dollar-based market.
It's an elegant trap. Now, let's look at India. Because while China represents the destruction of a non-dollar network, your text uses India as the prime example of the U.S. actively forcing a country back into the dollar ecosystem. What was India's calculated pivot here?
India is a fascinating case study. Leading up to this crisis, India was playing a very sophisticated balancing act. Despite immense global pressure, India remained the second largest buyer of Russian hydrocarbons.
They were buying Russian oil at a massive discount, refining it and supercharging their own economy, which obviously infuriated Washington.
It was a massive irritant. The U.S. administration needed to pull India away from the Russian energy sphere, but they couldn't just bully them. So the U.S. applied a very specific, calculated mechanism of pressure. They utilized tariff waivers.
Explain how that mechanism worked.
The U.S. held punitive tariffs over India's head. But instead of just enforcing them and starting a trade war, the administration offered waivers. However, the text explicitly notes that these waivers were highly conditional, transactional. In exchange for relief from U.S. tariffs, New Delhi had to take concrete steps to curtail its Russian oil imports.
But the U.S. didn't just tell them to stop buying from Russia, they told them who to buy from instead.
Exactly. India was pressured into a historic commitment, a pledge to purchase $500 billion in American goods over 5 years, and a very substantial component of that was American energy products.
I want to pause on that number. $500 billion. You don't just sign a check for $500 billion without fundamentally restructuring your domestic economy. By committing to that, India is physically replacing its Russian supply infrastructure with American supply infrastructure, all transacted in U.S. dollars.
It deeply and institutionally binds India to the U.S. dollar ecosystem. But the genius of the strategy, if you want to call it genius, is how the U.S. utilized European regulations to force India's hand even further.
This is the secondary mechanism regarding refined products. Walk us through how the EU unwittingly helped the U.S. trap India.
So as India was buying all this cheap Russian crude, they weren't just using it domestically. Indian refineries were acting as a massive global middleman. They would import Russian Ural crude, refine it into diesel and jet fuel, and then export those refined products to Europe.
It's the ultimate loophole. The oil molecule comes out of the ground in Siberia, gets refined in Mumbai, and ends up in a delivery truck in Berlin.
Exactly. But on January 21st, 2026, the European Union implemented a strict ban on oil products derived from Russian feedstock.
Meaning customs officials were now tracking the origin of the crude oil used to make the diesel.
Right. To comply with this EU ban and maintain access to the European export market, Indian refiners were forced to begin purging their tanks of Russian crudes. And where do they turn to replace that massive volume? They turn to the U.S., the Gulf, and the other dollar-denominated suppliers.
It is a phenomenal confluence of leverage. Europe bans the feedstock, the U.S. threatens the tariffs, and India is squeezed from both sides until they commit $500 billion to the American economy.
Now, the text does add a caveat here, noting that official confirmation of a complete nationwide halt of Russian imports by India is still absent. It is still a fierce negotiation, but the trajectory is clear.
Which brings us to Europe itself. The political rhetoric coming out of Brussels for the last several years has been entirely about energy independence and diversification. Have they actually insulated themselves?
The report is brutal in its assessment of Europe's true security. On paper, European politicians point out their energy mix has diversified. They're sourcing from Norway, the U.S., Algeria, and heavily from Azerbaijan.
Azerbaijan seems to be the new darling of European energy policy.
They've assumed a massive role. Azerbaijan is supplying 14 different European nations, and they even signed a landmark 10-year contract with Germany. So the optics look great.
But the math doesn't lie.
The underlying math is terrifying. The text points out that despite all this frantic diversification, the EU's total import dependency is still hovering near 57%. They still have to import more than half of all the energy required to keep the continent functioning.
I love the quote you included in the report. They said, "The problem hasn't been solved, it's been reformulated. Europe fundamentally cannot secure its gas needs from strategically safe sources."
They just traded one massive localized dependency for a basket of fragile dependencies scattered across the globe. And this is why the Hormuz shutdown is catastrophic for Europe. If 20% of global oil vanishes, the price of every remaining drop skyrockets. Europe is forced into a vicious bidding war against China and Japan for those exact same barrels.
And because that bidding war takes place in the dollar-denominated safe haven markets, Europe is forced to hemorrhage euros, convert them to dollars, and pay a massive premium. It drains capital from Europe straight into the U.S.
Exactly.
Okay, I have to step in here and challenge this. Because when we map out how perfectly this benefits the United States, it sounds like an omnipotent master plan. Are we really supposed to believe that bureaucrats in Washington intentionally engineered a global energy crisis just to fix a macroeconomic imbalance?
It's the right question to ask. Is this sheer serendipitous luck or deliberate orchestration? To answer that, the report relies on a rigid chronological timeline. When you trace the actions of the U.S. administration leading into 2026, the argument for a bureaucratic accident completely falls apart.
Then let's trace that timeline. Because your report highlights a massive correction to how most people understand the economic setup of this crisis, specifically regarding the IEPA tariffs. I want to spend some time on this because this is where the motive becomes clear.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the domestic panic inside the U.S. administration in late 2025. The U.S. was facing rising debt, massive trade deficits, and de-dollarization. To combat this, the administration had been heavily utilizing tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA.
For the listener, IEPA is essentially a legal sledgehammer. It allows the president to declare a national emergency and unilaterally impose tariffs, bypassing Congress.
Exactly. And the administration was using these IEPA tariffs to aggressively prop up the dollar, offset the trade deficits, and force nations to hold dollar reserves. It was their primary stability function for the dollar. But in late 2025, that weapon was breaking.
This is the crucial correction. Previous analyses assumed the courts were going to uphold these tariffs. They assumed there was a judicial green light. But your report shows the exact opposite was happening.
Yes, the judicial green light assumption is completely false. The legal foundation of the tariffs was crumbling. The administration was receiving clear signals that the courts were actively rejecting these broad IEPA declarations. The tariffs were facing impending judicial defeat.
No.
Furthermore, these current tariffs were not bound by previous bilateral agreements, and they were limited in time. They were expiring.
So if you are sitting in the White House in November of 2025, you are looking at a catastrophe. The very tool you use to artificially support the dollar is about to be ruled illegal.
Total panic. The signaling of the rejection pressures the administration. If the IEPA tariffs fail, the stability function for the dollar vanishes. The trade deficit balloons. They desperately needed a reliable, long-term alternative strategy.
And they needed it immediately. So the impending rejection of the tariffs pushed the administration to plan out an alternative, which was the petrodollar enforcement via a military crisis. Let's walk through how they methodically built that, starting in June 2025.
In June 2025, long before the major military flare-ups, the U.S. proactively reaffirmed its objective of reducing Iranian oil exports to absolute zero.
Not restrict, total eradication.
The declaration of economic war. Then, in September 2025, the U.S. unleashes comprehensive snapback sanctions.
And a snapback sanction is a financial contagion. It's not just the U.S. saying, we won't buy your oil. It means if a French bank processes an Iranian transaction, the U.S. cuts that French bank entirely out of the U.S. financial system. It's a binary choice.
Exactly. It targeted Iran's banking, energy, and shipping sectors. Then, between January and February of 2026, the economic warfare transitions into physical maritime intimidation.
You don't just magically teleport an aircraft carrier. It takes months of planning.
Right. On January 16th, the first carrier strike group deploys. A second follows in February. And the messaging was unambiguous. The U.S. explicitly stated that any Iranian attempt to disrupt shipping would trigger immediate strikes on Iranian export infrastructure, specifically painting a target on Karg Island.
Let's synthesize this. The administration realizes their domestic economic tariffs are failing in court. They immediately declare a policy of zero Iranian exports, They deploy financial contagion, they park two armadas at the choke point, and they threaten to obliterate Iran's primary oil terminal.
When you view those events chronologically, the argument that the U.S. is merely reacting is very difficult to sustain. The crisis isn't an accident. The crisis is the policy.
But there is one final piece of evidence your report presents. You call it the crucial absence. Tell us about the role of U.S. domestic oil production.
If the Middle East is engulfed in conflict and global oil prices are skyrocketing, what is the logical, politically popular move for an American president?
You would ban oil exports. You would tell voters, we are keeping American oil for Americans, and flood the domestic market to lower gas prices.
It's the most obvious domestic maneuver. But the administration conspicuously does not do it. They leave American energy flowing freely onto the volatile global market. Why?
Because keeping the oil at home doesn't save the dollar.
Exactly. Supplying the desperate global market with dollar-denominated American oil is the ultimate objective. They willingly suffer domestic political heat, higher gas prices for voters to fill that global vacuum with their own energy, forcing foreign nations to buy dollars.
They're sacrificing short-term domestic popularity to secure long-term macroeconomic dominance. Okay, I need to take a deep breath here, because the picture we've painted is relentlessly cynical. But if you turn on a White House press briefing, they will never say, we are risking World War III to save our bond markets.
Absolutely not. The publicly stated rationale is always framed in the language of moral imperative: security, regional stability, and above all, nuclear non-proliferation.
Which provides the perfect pivot to the second half of our deep dive. We need to hold this cynical financial theory up against the accepted framework of American national security. And your report heavily references the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS.
CSIS is one of the most influential think tanks in Washington. They effectively write the textbook on how the U.S. defense establishment views the world. We look at two primary pillars of CSIS strategy: critical mineral resource security and nuclear non-proliferation. Let's tackle the resources first.
Yes, because you draw a massive parallel between the Middle East today and what happened recently in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
The DRC case study strips away the rhetoric and shows us exactly how the U.S. behaves when strategic resources are on the line. The CSIS Critical Mineral Security Program explicitly frames access to resources like cobalt and copper as a hard, non-negotiable national security imperative.
And the ultimate battleground for that is the DRC. Let's walk through the mechanics there, because the previous understanding was that the DRC president, Felix Tshisekedi, simply offered the U.S. access in exchange for investment. But the reality is far darker.
It wasn't a polite diplomatic offer. It was a concession made under the threat of total annihilation. To understand the leverage, you have to look at Rwanda. For years, Rwanda has backed a vicious militia known as M23, operating in the eastern Congo.
An M23 is essentially a heavily armed resource cartel, right? They had already been seizing mines and illicitly offering stolen critical minerals to global supply chains.
Exactly. But recently, the M23 massively expanded its insurgency. They launched a highly coordinated offensive deep into DRC territory. It was an existential threat to the sovereign government in Kinshasa.
And here is where the geopolitics become incredibly cynical. While Rwanda is backing this militia tearing the Congo apart, what is the United States doing? Are they sanctioning Rwanda?
No. At the exact same time, the M23 is expanding its violent campaign. Major U.S. technology companies, with the implicit backing of the U.S. economic apparatus, were pouring vast financial commitments into Rwanda.
Let's connect those dots. The U.S. tech sector is financially bolstering Rwanda. Rwanda is using its resources to back M23. M23 is threatening to overthrow the government of the Congo.
You have a U.S.-backed, tech-funded proxy war threatening the very existence of the DRC government. President Tshisekedi realized he had no choice. To survive, to get the U.S. to call off the dogs, he had to fold.
And what did folding look like?
It meant breaking his word to Beijing.
Yeah.
Chinese mining companies have been promised massive, legally binding contracts to control the vast majority of Congo's mineral wealth. Under the existential pressure of the M23 insurgency, the DRC government conceded to U.S. demands, broke those contracts with the Chinese, and handed the broader mineral access over to Western interests.
They handed over the keys to the kingdom just to stop the bleeding. It's textbook realpolitik coercion. But here's why we are discussing this. CSIS analysts themselves, specifically Senior Associate Mvemba Fezo-Zolele, issued a massive warning about this exact strategy. What was his critique?
Dizeley warned that when Western nations prioritize raw resource extraction above actual governance and addressing the root causes of conflict, the resulting peace is incredibly fragile.
You're just papering over a war zone with a mining contract.
Precisely. The U.S. got its cobalt, but they did so by tacitly rewarding an insurgency. CSIS argues that if you secure resources without building genuine stability, you are just delaying an inevitable, much larger explosion of violence.
Now take that exact framework, that exact warning from the Congo, and overlay it onto the Middle East and the 2026 Iran crisis.
The parallel is exact. Just as the U.S. leverages a violent proxy war in the Congo to wrest control of critical minerals away from China, the theorized strategy suggests the U.S. is engineering a massive military crisis in the Persian Gulf to wrest control of the global energy market away from the de-dollarization movement.
They are treating the entire Middle East like a giant, highly unstable cobalt mine.
Yes, they are prioritizing the extraction of a resource, in this case global dollar dominance, over the actual stability of the region. By orchestrating a crisis that blockades the Strait of Hormuz, you are violating the core warning of the CSIS analysis. You are ignoring the root causes of stability in favor of immediate currency enforcement.
You get what you need for the next 5 years, but you guarantee a cataclysm in the next decade. The foundation is completely rotten. Which brings us to the final and most heavily publicized pillar of American strategy, the nuclear question. Because whenever Iran is mentioned, the first word used is nuclear.
And this is where the public narrative and the hidden financial logic violently collide. CSIS operates a massive proliferation prevention program. Their stated objectives are incredibly noble: deter states from acquiring nuclear weapons, engage in comprehensive arms control.
They are deeply involved in the mechanics of peace. The text mentions they run Track 2 dialogues. For the listener who doesn't work at the State Department, what is a Track 2 dialogue?
Track 2 dialogues are the hidden machinery of diplomacy. They are unofficial, back-channel discussions involving non-governmental experts, retired generals, and academics. Because they aren't official representatives, they can have incredibly candid conversations with adversaries without the rigid constraints of formal diplomacy.
They are the safety valves of international relations.
Exactly. CSIS has run Track 2 dialogues on U.S.-Russian crisis stability and European trilateral dialogues regarding nuclear risks for over a decade. And when it comes to Iran, CSIS is completely clear-eyed. They don't pretend Iran is a benign actor.
Right. The Burke Chair in Strategy at CSIS has published extensive analyses warning about Iran's growing capabilities.
They explicitly categorize Iran as a highly capable competitor that uses proxy warfare to destabilize the region. Iran's ballistic missile design, their precision strike capabilities, these are massive red flags that require serious diplomatic frameworks.
The nuclear threat is real. And this is exactly what makes the public narrative so impenetrable. The administration can point directly to these valid CSIS concerns and say, look, Iran is a threshold nuclear state funding proxy militias. This is why we have 2 aircraft carrier strike groups in the Gulf. We are enforcing global security.
The public rationale is absolutely bulletproof because it relies on genuine threats. But this is the crux of the entire report. The text argues that while the nuclear concerns are genuine, they are being utilized as a publicly acceptable shield. The nuclear threat is the shield behind which the sword of dollar hegemony is wielded.
So what does this all mean? What happens when these 2 massive objectives, the stated goal of nuclear peace and the hidden goal of financial dominance, inevitably collide?
This raises an important question about incentives. If the primary goal of the U.S. administration is genuinely nuclear non-proliferation, what does victory look like? Victory looks like Iranian compliance. You want Iran to stand down, dismantle their centrifuges, and sign a treaty.
You want stability. You want the shipping lanes to open and the risk of war to drop to 0.
Yes. But if the true goal, the hidden logic, is financial, if the real objective is restructuring the global energy market to force everyone back into the U.S. dollar to save the American economy from the collapse of the IEEPA tariffs, then Iranian compliance is actually a disaster.
Wait, walk me through that. Why is peace a disaster for the dollar?
Because if Iran fully complies, if they normalize relations and the crisis ends, the Strait of Hormuz is suddenly completely safe. The tension evaporates. And the moment the tension evaporates, what happens to all those non-dollar bilateral oil agreements that China and India were building?
They turn back on. China goes back to buying oil in yuan.
Exactly. Peace and stability in the Middle East instantly accelerates the de-dollarization trend that the U.S. is desperate to stop. So we have to ask the dangerous question. Does the administration actually want Iranian compliance? Or is compliance secondary to keeping the market in a state of sheer dollar-dependent terror?
I want you to really ponder the gravity of that. If the petrodollar theory is correct, pushing Iran toward a nuclear breakout or instigating a localized war actually serves the American financial objective better than a peace treaty, because a war guarantees the physical disruption of non-dollar energy flows.
It creates the exact geography trap required to enforce reverse de-dollarization. The theorized strategy actively requires an unresolved, highly volatile standoff.
But engineering a crisis like that directly fundamentally violates CSIS's foundational mission of risk reduction. You are intentionally escalating a nuclear standoff simply to solve a macroeconomic accounting problem.
And that is the terrifying contradiction at the heart of this entire geopolitical puzzle. The U.S. administration is using the righteous language of nuclear non-proliferation to execute a brutal economic policy that fundamentally increases the risk of regional war. They are talking about peace while actively architecting a crisis.
It is a stunning, deeply unsettling synthesis of the source material. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, tracing the mechanics of global power from central bank reserves to maritime choke points to proxy wars in the Congo. Let's try to pull all of this together.
I think the most important takeaway is that we must always view international conflict through a dual lens. The 2026 Iran crisis cannot be understood solely by watching the military movements.
Right, there is the public lens. This is the narrative of nuclear nonproliferation, countering proxy warfare, and securing critical resources. It forms the publicly defensible framework for American actions.
And then there is the hidden lens. This is the perspective that views the crisis not as an accident, but as a deliberately choreographed sequence, a sequence born out of domestic legal desperation over failing tariffs, executed through military threats, and designed specifically to physically sever non-dollar energy supply lines,
Forcing a panicked global market back into reliance on dollar-based producers. And as we wrap up, I want to address why this matters to you, the listener. Because it's very easy to listen to a discussion about macroeconomics and Middle Eastern shipping lanes and feel completely disconnected from it. Why should you care about the specific legal mechanisms of an IEPA tariff?
because the machinations we discussed today directly impact the value of the currency sitting in your bank account. The price you pay to fill your car with gas, the cost of imported electronics, the rate of inflation eating away at your savings, all of these are tethered to the global demand for the U.S. dollar.
If the de-dollarization trend succeeds, the American privilege of exporting our inflation ends. The purchasing power of the average citizen plummets. But if the petrodollar is artificially preserved through the orchestration of military crises, you might retain your purchasing power for a few more years, but the hidden tax you are paying is global instability and endless conflict.
You are trading long-term global survival for short-term financial comfort. The real geography of modern warfare is entirely financial.
As we sign off, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought. It's a concept for you to explore on your own, and it builds on everything we've unpacked today, particularly that stark warning from the CSIS analysis regarding the tragedy of the Congo.
The warning that peace must be the foundation, not a byproduct, of resource-driven cooperation.
Exactly. Peace must be the foundation. I want you to think about the absolute arrogance required to ignore that. If this hidden economic theory is true, the United States strategy successfully preserves the petrodollar today by intentionally destabilizing the Persian Gulf. They are ignoring governance, treating an entire region solely as an economic lever. But if you burn down the foundation to save the house, where do you live tomorrow? What entirely new, unmanageable, catastrophic global crisis will this artificial instability breed for the next generation? You cannot engineer chaos for profit without eventually being consumed by it.
A provocative and absolutely necessary warning.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of global power. Keep questioning the narratives, keep looking beneath the map, and we will see you next time on Epic.